Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Also in Berlin at the moment, although not together with me in my apartment, is FP's economics columnist, Adam Tooze. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, two segments today in the second half of the show. We're going to be talking about the economics of pilates, the workout regimen. So stick around. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, we have a data point for you all, and that is $2.4 trillion. That is the amount by which Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill, that's the name of the legislation Donald Trump has introduced in Congress, that if it passed, it would increase U.S. deficits over the next 10 years by that $2.4 trillion amount. While it does so, it would apparently also drop 10.9 million Americans from their current health insurance coverage. The bill does various things, as the name Big Beautiful Bill suggests. It's a kind of grab bag of all of Trump's legislative priorities, but at its heart, it is a bill that would extend existing tax cuts that Donald Trump introduced in his first term, while paying for them to some extent, though not completely, by reducing spending on Medicaid.
A new analysis from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says the bill, which would extend Trump's 2017 tax cuts, would balloon the deficit by $2.4 trillion.
In a post on X, Musk wrote, "I'm sorry, but I just can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, pork-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting..."
So this really is the heart of Trump's legislative agenda. Everything else he's been up to has all been executive action. This seems to be it in terms of actually passing laws. And it's currently being considered by the Senate. It's already passed, or some version of it has passed, the House of Representatives. Yeah, so we thought we'd get ahead of it by trying to unpack exactly what it does and how. Adam, unsurprisingly, Democrats unanimously oppose the bill. Republicans, for the most part, are supportive of it, although the final votes are not tallied. Though we've talked a lot about different factions in the Republican Party in recent episodes, and I'm curious, how do the various Republican factions relate to this bill? I mean, you know, there are obviously traditional Republicans who were always in support of tax cuts, but what about the kind of new Trump populism? I mean, what is the populist position on the big, beautiful bill exactly?
Yeah, what this thing with triple B, like it's built back better from the Biden era. Now, this is big, beautiful bill. American presidents seem to need them. And as you're saying, and it's important for listeners outside the US to recognize, just how narrow the window of legislation for an American president is. You basically have got to get things done early on in the first half of your term, because the likelihood is the midterms will swing against you 2 years in. And so this is the moment. I think you're right. This is a defining moment for the Trump presidency. And I think observers of the American political scene see this as a defining test also of the Republican Party at this moment, such as it is. And it's really a mess. It only passed the House by a wafer-thin majority, and there's already substantial opposition announcing itself in the Senate. You know, who knows? These people chicken out, like Trump himself. But it's pretty precarious, and that's because there is a tax-cutting faction in the Republican Party, and that's basically the line through here from 2017. But there's also, of course, a fiscal hawk faction in the Republican Party. And this bill does not, however much the, sort of Saddam-style press conferences of the Trump administration will try to say otherwise, this does not close the deficit, right? This makes the deficit way larger. And so there's already substantial opposition in the Senate that's announcing itself around that. The usual suspects have come out, but Elon Musk has also gone over to that side. And Musk was widely thought of as the kingmaker in the Republican Party because of the amount of money that he can throw at even relatively small down-ticket congressional races. And Musk has declared this whole thing an abomination. You're asking about the populists, with two different variants of that, if you like. One is the kind of Bannon-style sort of dark conservative. And Bannon hates this because of its fiscal implications. He has some dark fantasy of, some sort of inflationary disaster in the US. And then the Josh Hawley is the kind of Labourite version of the parties, also despises it because basically it's a bunch of tax giveaways for rich people at the price of cuts to ordinary working class Americans, which he's realistic enough to know this will entail. It's a hugely redistributive piece of legislation that shovels hundreds of thousands of dollars towards the richest Americans per household, whilst clawing money back from the poorest. I mean, the crazed situation here, and as Oren Cass, who passes as for the intellectual leader of the second Trump administration, has embarrassedly admitted that ultimately the only thing that makes sense here is that the Republicans are doing it because they did it for Trump in 2017, and he wants it, and he's going to get it, and they owe loyalty to Trump, and so they're going to deliver it. But Cass hangs his entire thesis about the increasing populism of the Republican Party not on the actual votes, but on the mood music. And what he points to is there's just no enthusiasm for this big, beautiful bill. There's no enthusiasm for it at all in the party, because this isn't where the party's heart and mind is at right now. But if that's the case, then you have this surreal picture of the first months of the Trump administration in which he's doing a tariff policy for which there's no social constituency in the United States, right? As we've talked about that repeatedly on the show, there isn't a big lobby for 140% tariffs on China. And there doesn't appear, even in this case, to be a massive rally of the Republican Party in favor of this legislation. So they're doing it to preserve faith with the president's legacy from 2017 and to glue the whole thing together. And this is the really sinister thing. Stephen Miller enters the fray, right? The truly ghoulish, grotesque, far-right advisor of Trump. And Miller lines this up and says this isn't about tax at all. This is about giving the president the powers to engage in absolutely massive deportations of illegal immigrants to the United States. And that's why you've got to vote for this. This is the most consequential piece of legislation. And that in itself is a sign of the fragmentation in the Republican Party, because if there's one thing they can all agree on other than loyalty to Trump, it's hostility and xenophobia towards migrants.
Yeah, and maybe to clarify that point, I mean, one of the marginal things in the bill relatively is increased spending on security forces that deport immigrants. And so that is presumably one reason to support it from the Trump administration's perspective. But yeah, I think you make a good point of pointing out the ways that Trump is an outlier in the party. I mean, more generally, in terms of his own also, not just lifelong or his commitment since adulthood to tariffs, but also to debt. I mean, that's how he ran his own business empire. He's always been a fan of debt, or at least not had a problem with debt. And I think that's very legible in this legislation. But then, yeah, you get these objections from across the party, including, one should point out here, that from Elon Musk, who was in the administration until very recently and now has come out very vociferously against the bill on his social media platform. And yeah, we can talk about the debt in I guess a bit, but I did want to sort of get to the way these tax cuts are being paid for, at least partially, and that's primarily through Medicaid cuts. Now, of course, there are other things I think that are being trimmed, including the spending on Biden's climate policies, but Medicaid cuts are at the heart of this, and they're coming in a form, those cuts are, that are themselves kind of deceptive in the sense that they're not simply cutting people's coverage, but introducing kinds of new regulations, work requirements that would then reduce overall spending on these programs. And so I'm curious, how do work requirements work in practice, so to speak? And how do they lead to reductions on the scale that the bill is envisioning?
Yeah, I mean, just for our non-American listeners who aren't, in the weeds of American social policy, what we're talking about here is Medicaid, which is the safety net for lower income Americans and families, children, not older people. That's Medicare, that provides public support for medical treatment for the worst off Americans. So it's not true to say that America doesn't have publicly provided health insurance. It does in the discriminatory means-tested mode. And this is expensive, as you'd expect. And of the $1.3, $1.4 trillion in clawback through which the Republicans are trying to close the giant deficit gap they're opening up with the tax giveaways, this makes up about, I think, 500 billion, something like that, 500 to 600 million. The rest is coming from the IRA and other smaller items. And as you're saying, Cam, American politics doesn't like to do direct subsidy or direct clawback. So when you're doing the Inflation Reduction Act under Biden, you have tax relief mechanisms that work indirectly to stimulate green investment. And in this case, as you're saying, what they're introducing or proposing to introduce are a series of tests of eligibility based on whether people are in work or not. And the majority of people on Medicaid already are, so roughly 2/3 are in either full-time or part-time work. Those who aren't are on the whole not working because they have excessive family responsibilities or are sick. And the idea is to design a more exclusionary mechanism so as to cut down on the bill to prevent people getting support who the Republicans, think of as basically taking advantage of the American welfare state. Welfare in America is widely understood to be a dog whistle term for white resentment at public support for poor people, poor black people. And that's what this is a campaign about. And there is some experience with these kind of efforts at state level. Various types of test mechanism have been introduced. And that is where these sort of cynical estimates of how far this procedural change will reduce the bill come from is basically you ratio up from the experience, say, in Arkansas. And the experience there is that a very large part of the exclusionary effect simply comes from the deterrent effect on stressed, often borderline illiterate, struggling, desperate people of having to fill out a bunch of punitive-looking paperwork at the moment when they're applying for support. And so whether or not they're eligible, we see a very substantial attrition of folks out of the system as a result of the deterrent effect of this kind of paperwork. So it's a cruel mechanism, right? It avoids political responsibility for what you're doing. It allows the Republicans to say, oh no, all we're doing is making this system do what was it was intended to do. Whereas everyone really everyone actually understands that this is an effort to exclude populations from benefits through administrative mechanisms. American unemployment insurance operates in quite a similar way across many Republican states. It's notionally there. It's just humiliating and difficult to get to the point where very large numbers of people who actually desperately need the help fail to apply for it, or when they do apply, fail to jump through the hoops.
Yeah, I think this is worth underscoring then, that the government is sort of self-conscious about paperwork as a mechanism of control. I mean, like not just control in the sense of oversight, but control in the sense of, bullying in some way, right? I mean, that this is not a kind of accidental effect. It's like using neutral mechanisms or neutral seeming mechanisms to exert that deterrence, which I think is interesting. It's what allows the government then to claim this is a reduction in fraud, or rather than a kind of explicit policy change.
It's kind of a punitive version of behaviorism, isn't it? It's kind of it's not so much a nudge as a trip. It's like, it's not pushing you towards something, it's tripping you up on your way to something, to the point where at some point you give up wanting to go there.
But I guess you could say it's sort of weaponizing.
Yeah.
Nudge.
That was exactly the weapon. I mean, so I think of a trip as a weaponized nudge, like when you accidentally
exactly.
on purpose
reverse engineering it. Yeah, exactly. But I guess to turn attention to the other side of this legislation, namely all of the spending on tax cuts that's not paid for through those punitive cuts, and the increase in U.S. debt that produces in its wake. How should we think about the effects of that increase in debt? I mean, first of all, from a macroeconomic perspective, and then from this perspective of individual Americans. I mean, how would they notice this increase in debt in their lives?
I think there are a few fairly non-controversial claims one can make. The first would be that continuing to run truly huge deficits at a time of full employment, the sort of deficits you would normally expect to see at the height of an economic crisis, are being run in the US now routinely at full employment, what that does is to keep the economy running hot. I mean, the idea being bandied around by the Republicans that somehow this is, this big, beautiful bill is going to accelerate the US economy to 3 or 4% growth. I think that's nonsense, because what it really does is, after all, to just perpetuate the existing status quo. If they don't pass this, a bunch of tax giveaways that were given away in 2017 are removed, and so the tax rate would go up. So what this does is to continue the existing unbalanced fiscal regime in the US, which helps to run the economy hot. It helps, therefore, to cushion some of the negative effects of the tariffs on the US economy, but it does so in a highly unequal way. So in the most extreme version, if you take the Stephen Miller view, this is a license for mass deportation. So that has a macroeconomic effect, because what you're basically doing is shifting the balance of power dramatically at the bottom end of the US labor market. And we're already seeing the deterrent effect. It's underreported, I think, as a fact, but the best measure we have of illegal migration to the US, which is encounters between the American border force and illegal migrants, has plunged to historically low levels. So if the aim of the game here is to tighten up the bottom end of the US labor market, it's quite likely to do that. That may help lower paid workers gain higher wages. On the demand side, however, there is an absolutely massive skew at the top end towards perpetuating huge inequality, adding pressure at the bottom end at the same time with the Medicaid cuts that we've been talking about. So what it'll do is to continue the unbalanced growth regime of the current moment, I think, where potentially there could be some bump to folks at the bottom end of the labour market. We've spoken at length at various points about who exactly that would be. Most likely, I would think Latino workers already in the workforce are the people who are most likely to benefit from this curtailing of migrant work. At the top end of the income distribution, it's going to be rich American households that continue to drive demand, though, of course, they tend to save more of their income. So it will perpetuate this unbalanced growth model characteristic of the US in recent times. If you look at the debt market, where the financing of ultimately this deficit is being run, I am not a debt alarmist. I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about the situation. But if you are going to pump between $1.5 and $2 trillion worth of new treasuries into the debt market every year, henceforth, you're going to have to persuade investors to reallocate their portfolios to absorb that debt. And the way that you do that is to offer higher interest rates. And so what you would expect is that this will anchor, especially the longer term interest rate, at a higher level. We're over 5% now for 30-year bonds in the US. That's where you would also expect to see a substantial correlation with the mortgage market. So one of the effects you would expect, I think, is sustained upward pressure, a new plateau, if you like, in mortgage finance in the US as a long-run effect. And then that ripples through the entire credit system. But that is heavily mediated by the business strategies of American banks and other providers of credit. So continued running hot, skewing in a complex social balance and a higher long-run level of interest rates.
And I suppose this will also put the Federal Reserve in an awkward position if we anticipate that, as interest rates go up and people find it harder to finance home purchases or credit card payments, that Trump will probably put pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates, at least judging from his past experience. So, yeah, I guess the Fed could be facing pressure here. Is that fair to expect?
Yeah, that's already started. The bullying started straight away. I mean, as you said, with Trump, there are some things that are just, they don't seem to be terribly context, shall we say, or reality dependent. And so he's into tariffs and he's into debt and he doesn't like high interest rates. And, he never likes high interest rates. The world's always better with low interest rates. So when he comes to power, sorry, I'm actually doing Trump hand movements while I'm saying this. It's kind of weird. It's catchy. The consequence is that, he's going to end up in a fight with the Fed because the Fed is, the Fed's going to claim we're data dependent and we need to put the interest rate where the interest rate needs to be for macroeconomic stability, for containing inflation, for maximizing employment. We're doing our thing. And that does run up against an economic policy, which is kind of, in Trump's case, it's kind of a matter of affect in a sense. He has these deeply held views which are resistant to immediate realities.
Yeah, I've thought that his relationship with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, may have something to do with this combination of economic views, because Erdogan is the only other political leader who I know of who's kind of insisted on lower interest rates as a way of combating, inflation, and that's not worked out in Turkey. But yeah, maybe that explains.
I think Erdogan may actually have a more sophisticated economic. Sorry, I've just been catty. I'm not sure that. Because Erdogan isn't a property developer, right? He's a hard scrabble street politician compared to Trump. But yes, I agree. It's a very unusual. So it's an unusual set of preferences.
Well, to maybe wrap up this conversation, I guess I want to ask about the perspective of America's economic elites, who, for the most part, could, I guess, be expected to be supporting this bill, although there are some kind of outliers who've gotten attention. But in the ways we're describing, we're talking about a kind of newly skewed American economy, increasing debt that, could produce instability of various kinds. And how do you think those economic elites are thinking about the risks of that instability? I mean, do they, operate from the assumption that if a catastrophe ends up looming, that it could be averted once it actually arrives, I guess, on the personal level, if not then the national level, if that's how they're thinking about it? Or I guess, are they just not aware of these potential risks largely? Or, yeah, if they do have confidence, in avoiding more responsible economic policy, what is that confidence based on, do you think?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. We decided to talk about this obviously because of the news flow in the US, but I also wrote a piece in the New York Times about the deficits and their meaning. And you and I have been talking, for months now, obviously, about Trump and how to interpret him. And we had that long conversation a few weeks ago now about, the kind of end times fascism interpretation of Trump and how cogent that is. So I found myself, in response to your question here, really beginning to think through, okay, what is my consistent position on Trump, given all of the various stances I've taken? So you could, I think, read the fiscal politics of the current moment in terms of an end times Trumpism. So there is an American elite, and I think it's kind of undeniable that it exists. It clearly doesn't include Musk because he's speaking up against the deficits. But there are some who basically think of, this as a one-way ticket into catastrophe. And so that's fine. You just ride the train and then bail out if necessary when you have to through seasteading or going to Mars or something like that. But it's quite telling that Musk and Bannon actually have converged in condemning this big, beautiful bill. So I actually don't find that a very convincing story, though you could stitch it together and say it's consistent that a sort of, a politics beyond the future would be one which doesn't really have to take the budget constraints seriously. So you could, in fact, flip the entirely opposite way and say the Trump administration is the fulfillment of the basic political science prediction that you should never expect irresponsible democracies to run balanced budgets. Like, why would you anticipate that? Instead, what they do is they make big, bold promises. They have big ambitions. They say they're going to back those up by tax increases because they need to look responsible. They offer voters the big dramatic bargain of policy now, pay the costs now, and in the future the world will be better. And they never actually deliver on it. And so you end up with chronic deficits. And you could, I think, just simply say, well, Trump is the arrival of the utterly cynical norm of democratic deficit politics, or the Trump era, or the last 10 years of American politics. But as I was arguing in the Times piece, the surprising thing is that though that on the face of it is an intuitive prediction about democracy, it's not actually borne out by the track record of most modern democracies, which go through phases of increased deficits for more or less good reasons, and then go through phases of really determined, teeth-gritted consolidation, even though you would expect that no democratic politician could deliver that. In Germany, the Schwarze Null was in fact incredibly popular. The debt break was very, very popular with a substantial fraction of the population. Italy, for heaven's sake, has been running primary surpluses. That's budget surpluses before they have to figure out the interest payments for decades. That's Italy. The United States, under Clinton, after all, balanced the books and ran a surplus. And even under Obama, in 2010, 2011, after the big deficits of the 2008 crisis, the Democratic administration tried to, in Obama's word, tighten belts. So if we're going to say that Trump is finally, if you like, the arrival of what political scientists have always said democracy would deliver, we can't just say, well, that's always been the case, because it's new. And so I think we need a story of degeneration in American democracy, or a kind of unbalancedness and unhinging. So I think ultimately what really best explains this is polarization. And what we've seen basically is the American elite splitting, probably from the Reagan era onwards, because that's when famously Dick Cheney remarked that Republicans discovered that deficits don't matter. And there is a hardcore of Republican biased elite Americans who basically want out of the social contract. That doesn't mean they want to go seasteading or living on Mars. They want to retreat to their country club, they want to retreat to their gated community, and they do not want the rest of actually existing American reality to intrude on the affluence which they think they richly deserve as a result of their success, which they, of course, read as both an individual merit, but also the true reality of America if only all Americans were American. And the problem, of course, is that loads of Americans have stopped really being American. And those you have to keep on the other side of the fence. And they maybe get some Medicaid if they're really entitled, but if they don't, well, then they don't. And so then they simply suffer. So I would think of this as a kind of break in American politics, a kind of polarized splitting, a disintegration of the polity, but it isn't the seasteading going to Mars exit. It's more like what you might call a kind of country club patriotism. It's more a kind of, I've suddenly realized it's more reminiscent of a colonial regime in a sense, or even apartheid, where you have, an elite minority, elite self-style bunkering itself off against the rest of society, doesn't give up on the social vision, but just maintains an intensely hierarchical version of it. And I think that's maybe where we see this. The result is deficits, because they're just not willing to pay for Medicaid. They're just not willing to pay for the minimal apparatus of the American welfare state. And from the 80s onwards, they discover that thanks to the willingness of foreign investors to hold American debt, it really isn't a problem if America runs deficits. And even in this absolutely worst case, it's worth saying, this Congressional Budget Office thinks this is going to blow out the deficit by 2.4 trillion, something like that in due course. That's 10% of American GDP. So the extreme case here is one that remains, within the bounds of the feasible. So you engage in, arguably one of the most irresponsible fiscal politics in history, which I think is, a fair title for 2017 and this one, the Big Beautiful Bill. And in relation to the enormous capacity of the US economy, you can still absorb it. And so the idea, the fantasies of disaster and catastrophe are quite rightly dismissed, because they're just that's not going to transpire. That's not on the board. But what we are seeing is a progressive hollowing out of the American polity as a functioning entity. And the best way to think about that is not by means of seasteading and Mars, but by means of the country club.
Okay, so the interpretation here is that basically the country can absorb this level of irresponsibility and instability from this elite perspective, and they kind of have this option of internal exit somehow.
I don't think they'd even describe it as exit at all. I mean, I think if you think about those sorts of folks, they think of themselves as preserving the real America. I mean, we think we should grant this to MAGA, right? They're not going to Mars. They think they are where the real America actually resides.
But it means that it's not a generalized society. I mean, America is not, and that's, I think, also what the colonial, analogy you're drawing comes in. I mean, and that's the social basis, though, of any real conservatism would be some investment, and belief in the existing society. But I guess that social basis doesn't exist in this interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, so this is really interesting. We should speak more about this, because this is interesting in inverted commas. I think we shouldn't overrate any of this stuff. But this is where the Hawleys and the Oren Casses and all these kind of people are trying to craft some, ginned up understanding of American social conservatism. Their embarrassment at what the reality looks like, I think, speaks for itself in the current moment.
I'm sure we will return to the topic, but we should take that break here and return to talk about Pilates. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is $2,500. That is the average cost in the United States of a Pilates reformer machine. That's a piece of equipment that is a necessary and central part of one form of the Pilates exercise regimen. Adam and I decided to talk about Pilates, originally actually in combination with yoga. This was inspired by a conversation we had at a baby shower here in Berlin with a Pilates instructor. And I thought it would actually be worth just focusing on Pilates, though, as I kind of dug into a bit of research, partly because, I thought it was interesting that I couldn't even get information on how big the Pilates industry is. It's sort of necessarily combined with yoga, at least in the market research. And yeah, the history of Pilates, it turns out, is interesting on its own. And personally, I've only heard of Pilates in recent years, but it's a phenomenon with its own interesting history going back many decades. And so, Adam, why don't we start with that history? What exactly are the origins of the Pilates exercise regimen?
Yeah, it's completely fascinating, and I'm really glad that we jumped on this as a topic, because it's such an interesting slice of history, really. Whose history it is in itself kind of very interesting. Is it like European history, American history, global history? So Pilates is a guy, Joseph Hubertus Pilates, who was born in Mönchengladbach in Germany in December 1883 and grew up in a family. His mum was a sort of early sort of natural healer kind of person before Naturheilkunde had really been formalized. His dad was an enthusiastic amateur gymnast in the tradition of German gymnastics of the 19th century. Pilates got super interested in late 19th century body culture. This is the moment when bodybuilding is beginning to emerge from a variety of different influences. One of the centers of that body culture, other than Germany, was Britain. And in 1913, he moves to Britain to work as a circus tumbler, taking much of his training in the early bodybuilding circuit of the late 19th century with him. And then as a German recently arrived, he's interned on the Isle of Man with 24,000 other inmates. So Germans who are not British citizens end up housed there. He's not a prisoner of war camp. He's not a soldier. He's just a circus performing bodybuilder who finds himself on the wrong, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and is in this camp. And in the camp, in part, I think, is a quite serious effort to try and keep people fit. And camps famously become the site both of TB infection, but also of the Spanish flu epidemic at the end of the war. It's produced by lots of bodies in close proximity. He engages in this development of a sort of stationary training regime. He's a nurse during the war, so one of the things he has to think about a lot is how to strengthen people's bodies while they're lying in beds. And out of this comes a whole variety of training techniques, which he then in 1919, when he's forcibly repatriated to Germany, takes back to the Weimar Republic, which is eager for this kind of thing. And one of its applications is boxing. And Pilates becomes, in the 20s, a well-known trainer, physiotherapist, we might now say, of the Berlin German boxing scene, which, of course, in the history of boxing is an important scene in the interwar period. And, in fact, one of the people that introduces the famous Max Schmeling, who will fight, the big fights with Joe Louis, to the American boxing scene. And it's on the back of that, with his brother already in St. Louis, that Pilates decides to emigrate with his package of physical training ideas to the United States and to New York. And in 1929, in the same month that he files his petition for naturalization in New York, he also opens the Pilates Universal Gym in New York City. And the extraordinary thing is that this body culture, late 19th century crystallization, trained in a wartime internment camp by way of the global boxing scene of the interwar period, becomes the central rehab place for the dance scene in New York in the 1930s. And it's not by accident that we had this conversation at Sarah and Connor's baby shower, because Sarah's a noted modern dancer, and it was her friend who is now a Pilates instructor, that started talking to us about this. And it's amazing. Like George Balanchine, Martha Graham, everyone you've ever heard of in American modern dance was Pilates' patient. Uncle Joe was the guy who fixed heavily stressed dancers' bodies in New York from the 1930s onwards. He becomes, in dancing circles, extremely famous. In the 40s and 50s, his gym his I guess, what do we call it, studio on the Upper East Side was the center for dancers' recuperation. And this is what Pilates emerges out of. He dies in 1967 at the age of 83 as this living link between the avant-garde art scene of New York, the kind of new age preoccupations of the early 20th century, and Anglo-German physical culture. It's really quite an incredible story.
Wow, yeah. And sure enough, the instructor we were speaking to was a former ballerina herself. And so I guess I wasn't aware of the, genealogy of that link and how far back it goes. But to return to the comparison or contrast, I guess, as it were, with yoga, I'm curious how they do compare in terms of this exercise being embedded kind of in a broader worldview. And in yoga's case, I mean, it has kind of links to a spiritual worldview, and there's a kind of link between the body and the spirit or the mind in terms of thinking about the practice. Is Pilates similar in the sense of having a worldview that is comprehensive in that way? Or if it's not quite as comprehensive in terms of, branching out into spiritual matters, is there something specifically or distinctively German about it then?
So I think, it's a sort of triple yes. Like Pilates himself and many of the subsequent notable practitioners are deeply versed in a Western appropriation of Eastern body culture and practices. So he himself, like, a whole cast of characters on the German cultural scene of the late 19th and early 20th century, was fascinated by yoga. He practiced Tai Chi. Many of the central Pilates notions of, centering the core and so on come out of that deep understanding, or a Western understanding of an Eastern tradition. This is a distinctively, it's on the one hand coming, if you like, you could say naively from Asia to Europe. You could also say it's a distinctively European preoccupation of the late 19th and early 20th century to be into the combination of spiritual practices like yoga, but also martial arts. And for Pilates, the combination of stretching and so on, but also the martial arts component is very significant, as is testified to by his relationship, not just to dancers, but to boxers. But then I think the third element to say is that idea of mind-body is, after all, not something that the West has to import from the East. It's deep in the Western tradition, going back to the Greeks, and the Hellenic preoccupations of European culture in the 19th and early 20th centuries are palpable, right? They're very, very profound. And in the two zones in which Pilates made his career, both Germany and the Anglosphere, they're absolutely powerful. In the German case, the resurrection of national politics and culture in the early 19th century was quite closely linked to an obsession with gymnastics. So Turnvater Jan, who was in Pilates's grandfather's generation, was a great inspirer of German body culture in the wake of the Napoleonic invasion and the effort to rebuild Germany in the face of outside resistance. So that's one strand. And the other strand is really the one that you see very, very prominent in Anglo-American culture. Just think of the culture of playing field sports that is practiced in the elite high schools, the public schools in Britain, and then absorbed into the Choates, the Andovers of the United States in the late 19th century. This idea that persists in the US all the way down to the present day, that you should have scholar athletes, right? Which is now absent in continental European higher education, but still very powerful in the US and explicitly linked to Greek examples, was incredibly powerful for British and German body culture in the late 19th century. So somebody like Eugene Sandow, who is really thought of as the father of modern bodybuilding, explicitly did kind of investigations into the gymnasium practice of the Greeks And Sando goes on to be the personal trainer to King Edward VII and George V of Britain. So before Pilates makes his more ragged migration from Germany to Britain by way of the circus and an internment camp, his great idol, Sando, is, going the high route and is literally the personal trainer to the British monarchs.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, to some extent, obviously, I see the commonalities between those traditions. And then on the other hand, when you bring up the British tradition, stretching maybe even back to the Greeks, it seems like there's a more kind of gentlemanly tradition that's more about sort of moderation or something in all things, that, this kind of gentleman's ideal. Whereas in the German case, I think of it as sort of more systemic and totalizing in some sort of Germanic way. I mean, the Father Jan Turnen movement, which you can visit here in Berlin, like where gymnastics, modern gymnastics started as this kind of like athletic movement that also though became intensely political. And it's this claim that it's like sort of like the best way of doing exercise, and it's connected to everything else. It's like it seems to be also what Pilates is claiming. It's like the one way to perfect.
Yeah. I mean, don't underestimate the Anglo thing. I mean, it was only recently that the question, what did you do when you were at Cambridge, referred to the subject that you studied as opposed to the game that you played. Like for the gentry elite of the late 19th and early 20th century, the physical exercise component, the sport, was an absolutely essential. It was totalizing in its own way. It was all about rugger or rowing But I see your point that it maybe doesn't have the same ideological charge. But you could say that that's also the privilege of a hegemonic power, right?
I don't know.
Turnvater Jan is an insurgent nationalist.
Yeah, and there's different ethical claims involved in each. I don't know. Like a sort of like, virtue ethics is its own kind of totalizing thing, but it's different than kind of Kantian Germanic deontological ethics. Anyway, I'm really now getting off track. But to return to Pilates, in practice now, this was something that in our conversation we learned this past weekend, and sure enough turns out to be the case. Pilates is not copyrighted as a concept, and I'm curious what effect exactly now that has on its economics and how it's practiced right now.
I think mainly what it's enabled is a kind of free-form spread of Pilates around the world, starting from the United States. The New York side went a little bit dead in the 80s with the urban crisis in the US. The famous studio was in the end boarded up and stopped functioning. It's a rather sad end to the story, I think. But by that point, Pilates had traveled to California, where it became very popular with some of the Hollywood set. There's a famous couple of studios there. And then the big breakout is really in the 80s with endorsements by Madonna, apparently. Was significant, and then Oprah Winfrey. And so sort of high visibility public endorsements by female celebrities, in Madonna's case, of course, very body forward, body positive, was crucial, I think, to exploding Pilates. But the result is also a kind of unregulated growth to a very considerable scale. I mean, you're right to say that it's difficult to get, clear numbers, but, market reports, and it's really difficult to know these market research things that AI coughs up for you when you Google online. It'll tell you that the Pilates and yoga studio market worldwide is $152 billion. Now, I don't know whether I believe that or not, but that's a big number if it's even remotely true. It's quite clear that, at least 10 million plus people around the world are engaged in some form of Pilates. So these are the sorts of figures that get bandied around. And I think that's enabled by the fact, in part, that there's really the person that we were talking to was quite adamant, wasn't she, that it was a problem for, what should we call it, the discipline, the culture of Pilates, that it was so poorly regulated and so easy, therefore, presumably for relatively cynical, irresponsible operators to get in on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think she'd done a lot of training, etc., to legitimately or feel like she was legitimately calling herself a Pilates trainer. But apparently anyone can call themselves a Pilates trainer. So I guess beware to people out there interested in a Pilates class. You might want to ask for the credentials and double check if they have read up on the original texts, as it were. But I guess to wrap up this conversation, I mentioned that, personally, I've only sort of encountered Pilates in recent years, and now, sure enough, it seems to be in practically any gym you might sign up for, they would be offering Pilates classes. And, in one sense, it seems like it could be a rediscovery of this tradition. Or on the other hand, it might just be a fad. There are fads that come and go. So as best you can tell, do you think Pilates is here to stay? And how would we know if it's a fad or not? I mean, what indications are there one way or the other?
Well, it's certainly like an exploding boom. I was surfing around trying to find some way of anchoring an answer to this question and came across this extraordinary story of, I don't know whether you saw it, so part of the thing with Pilates is that you use, at least for some of the practice, you use equipment. These benches with bands and levers. And these are expensive, which is why it's preeminently a studio practice. And they were expensive at least until Aldi. Aldi decided to introduce a home Pilates equipment for the asking price of, when it was put on sale in the UK, £150. So that's like €150, $150. It unleashed literally crowd scenes, like screaming crowds of desperate British, largely women, outbidding each other, climbing over equipment, sitting on boxes of this equipment. So it really is like a craze to an extent I had no idea. And clearly the promise of body beauty, of flexibility at a price that doesn't break the bank is incredibly attractive right here, right now. And when Aldi gets in on the act, you know that they must have done some serious market research to be doing this. No doubt the machine comes from China. And so I thought maybe the way to test this proposition, other than just the heat of the enthusiasm in the current moment, is this a trend that's going to break in China? Because the Chinese market potentially is larger than everywhere that Pilates has reached so far. And lo and behold, if you look online, you'll see significant numbers of, young and in fact middle-aged female influencers who are very, very, very important in driving commercial trends in China, setting themselves up with Pilates equipment. The richer, more affluent influencers have beautiful apartments, also have the professional equipment at home. There are pictures of gaggles of middle-aged Chinese women who are, all proudly taking their selfie of themselves in front of the machine. So if it were to take off there, if I don't know, it comes to replace the Tai Chi, which so many of us sort of in a rather cliched way associate with middle-aged Chinese and elderly Chinese people in a beautiful park going through their Tai Chi moves. Like if it were to break into that kind of space, this would just have been the prelude to a giant explosion. It's sufficiently syncretic. It's sufficiently, kind of from the left field. One could even say perhaps sufficiently German to attract a kind of an audience in China, because physical practice, as Falun Gong and so on have discovered, can be controversial in China. It can be seen as a sort of, resistant. No one wants to see a Turnvater Jan in China right now. But if it's kept in this zone of celebrity dance, then maybe it has a big future there. Would love to know. Maybe this is something for our listeners. If we have listeners in China and they've seen the opening of studios online, it looks like there are studios popping up all over the place in Shanghai and Beijing.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess you need the Chinese Oprah Winfrey to come out in support. But I guess we don't know Pilates politics, what they were. If he had any politics at all, it seems he was rather apolitical.
The claim is, sounds like the sort of thing that gets cooked up. I'm just going to give you it for what it's worth, is that because he was such a well-known body guy in 20s Weimar Republic, and because he had some experience in dealing with military casualties in World War I, he was actually asked by the Reichswehr, the German army, to devise a physical training program for the Reichswehr, and by way of this got wind of...
Wait, I want to clarify. The Nazi
No,
Reich
the Reichswehr in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, because he leaves in 26.
Got it.
So he's in Berlin, he's Max Schmeling's mate, he's in the scene in Berlin, and German officers and, guys who are in the gyms, in the fencing salons or whatever, become aware of this man and think, hey, he might have something to contribute to the rearmament program that we're secretly planning. And this might be the Turnvater-Jahren of our generation, to rebuild German manhood for the great national struggle of liberation that is to come. And the claim on these, Pilates in-house history sites is that's the moment where he realized he needed to get out of town, he needed to get out of Dodge, because he was a pacifist, because he wasn't interested in seeing, European society being blown apart again by another war. Which, is perfectly plausible. Lots of people in the Weimar Republic were, All Quiet on the Western Front was a giant smash hit. He's been in an internment camp. He's seen the slaughter. He was a nurse. It all adds up into a picture. I just can't verify it.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe another contrast with yoga, which I remember reading at some point, was also a kind of used by soldiers as training. But in any case, we should end the conversation here. Thanks to Dana, who we were talking to at the baby shower, and congrats to Sarah and Connor on the coming baby. Okay, we will end the conversation here. We'll be back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners, including Peter Thomas, Lucius Pestalozzi, Philip Popp, John Ward, Vladan, Anthony Sin in Ottawa, Jonah Langen-Marmer, Alan Scott, Jay in Asheville, and Charles Lardy. I hope I pronounced those names right. I apologize if I slipped any up, but as always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwosepod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thanks very much for listening, and we will be back in your feed next week.